All right. Um, yeah. Welcome, guys. So there's a lot of things. There's always a lot. Lately, I feel like the more I think, there's always a lot to think through. But here's a couple of things that I've noticed that is difficult to express in thinking about miscommunication, art, and I'm going to try my best to relate to these topics and kind of bring them into a close. But it's as usual. It's always it's a difficult thing to grasp in its entirety. Um, so I'm gonna try to begin with some of my critiques about popular culture concerning poetry. Um, and because there's something about this that is not quite grappled with. But I'm gonna share a poem from Rupi Kaur, and then I'm gonna try to think with you guys. Obviously, I can't do this in real time, but I'm gonna try to think with you guys in a way. So Rupi Kaur has a one book that she released. It's called Homebody, and here's a short poem that I'm gonna share with you guys. And for the most part, most of her poems are relatively short. There are some longer ones, but there is something about the vocabulary that is always a little bit disturbing to me, but not in the sense that people would think. So here's one of them. One of the poems is, "Why do I let my mind get under my skin? I am so sensitive." There's something about the uh, phenomenon of the style that Rupi Kaur has brought to the surface of uh, subjectivity. Um, Specifically, I would say woman subjectivity, but I wouldn't I I don't want to confine it to that. Maybe it's better to say feminine subjectivity. Uh, but um, so how do we understand this kind of simplistic uh, poem, right? That why do I let my mind get under my skin? I am so sensitive. It's very relatable, right? The words that she's saying is very relatable. But what I've noticed about poetry like this is that it becomes a kind of a perverse enjoyment, if that makes any sense. Now, to be clear, the people that are touched by these poems, they don't perceive them as a perverse enjoyment. And what do I mean by perverse enjoyment? What I mean by perverse enjoyment is that the subject finds its suffering, finds its own suffering deeply amusing in some sense, and it involves a kind of simplistic approach to expressing the emotions. In my opinion, now what I've noticed, because and I bring this up because I think it's a real, there's something about this, there's something about this problem that is um, something that Isabel Miller kind of pointed at. She said, I do think she was trying to hint at like that she does think art can be the answer, but it's the kind of art that we create today that is troubling in some sense. So I will try to frame, and I think the difficulty of talking about art is that we always come across this issue of possibly either placing popular art or pop culture art in a kind of lower, giving it a sort of lower status versus you could say higher art, like some people would argue, like Shakespeare and Rilke. Um, those are all fair points. I definitely agree. Uh, to some extent, I agree those are higher forms. Um, the difficulty is always placing the value on this, what we would call higher forms or lower forms of art. Um, but I want to challenge the immediate judgment of the art in a kind of different way. Um, I do think there is something problematic about the sort of micro poetry, but there is something about this micro poetry that has become very popular, especially like Instagram. You could say some people say it's Instagram poetry, and I think Drake also released a poetry book, and it's literally the same. It's basically very Instagrammable. But what I've noticed it's that its sentences, it's they are poetic lines almost in some sense that um, indicate some type of visceral emotion. Like it's such it's such a really strange concept because it's like in some sense the poets what they're saying is nothing new, right? It's nothing new, and I'm going to read this again. I'm going to read this again, except I'm going to read a different poem because it's nothing new. Um, and so let me see if I can get it. Um, let's see. Okay, so here's one. Here's another one that's nothing really new. Depression is silent. You never hear it coming, and suddenly it's the loudest voice in your head. What I've noticed about micro poetry and its visceral effect on people and why they enjoy it to some degree is because it has this quality of self that is never quite expressed, even though everybody thinks it, I think. And I'm trying to approach this from the way the subject feels and gravitates towards this poetry. Why is the subject attracted to this poetry? And this is why I don't want to simply judge it and say, oh yeah, it's lower form of art. I don't know why people are interested. What I'm trying to understand is why people are interested in this specific poetry. Because at one point I was interested in this specific kind of poetry, but I'm trying to understand how the movement occurs from enjoying uh, sentimental confessional poetry that's very simplistic, like I feel lonely in a dark room. Like that's a lot of the micro poetry that is kind of perpetuated today on Instagram. And you get popular poets like Rupi Kaur, R.H. Sin. There's another one. I think it's like R.H. I think it's like something R.M. Drake or something like that. They're very popular. They're very Instagrammable poets. And there's something that is disturbing about this because if we look at this at a macro scale, why is it that the poetry itself has become so small and for me, I think if I want to bring up the notion of technology and time and acceleration, is that the attention can no longer um, perpetuate a distance, can no longer perpetuate a sort of a looking, a gazing at something longer than a paragraph, right? It can no longer fixate itself on these words. And it's even worse if the words are obscure and difficult to navigate. So when we talk about technology and art, we have to think about this idea of acceleration, attention, and how it sort of fixates and transforms art, but also how it transforms the subject. The subject can only understand itself, it seems, in these very short, precise, emotional statements. And I'll try to give another example of this. Here it is, right? My mind, my body, and I all live in one place, but it feels like we are three completely different people. Immediately, um, immediately you start. Uh, what is being said here, in my opinion, is not really a kind of revelation of sorts on the self, but I think what is so seemingly attractive to this kind of poetry is that because the subject is so deprived of a real sense of you could say leisure, a real sense of leisure that the subject has to, in order to sort of compensate for the acceleration of technology and its effects on art, it has to be a very simplistic line of sentiment. It can no longer tolerate poetry that is more that involves more leisure, basically. And poetry that involves more leisure demands time. It demands more effort and attention. But what I'm trying to get at is that the criticism of these works of art is not just that they are lower forms of art. I don't. I agree to a certain extent that these are lower forms of art, I guess, but I think it would be missing the point that these forms of art and these almost very shallow, um, superficial statements reveal very deep metaphysical rootings about our time, about how there isn't enough time. That there just isn't enough time to really explicate this process. And because everything is accelerating so fast, all you have time to say and give in a work of art, in a kind of poetry, in a poetic manner, is to say something like, is to say things like um, Rupi Kaur, right? To say things like depression is silent, you never hear it coming, and suddenly it's the loudest voice in your head. That's all she has time. That's all she has time to say. Um, of course, the subject is not interpreted this way, but what I'm trying to get at is I think the emotional attraction to this concept, the attraction to this kind of poetry reveals that um, there is no leisure in art. Um, and so the way art is trying to survive is by its lack of leisure, in some sense. Its lack of leisure. Now you could say that this is a part of the sort of acceleration of production and commodification, right? We could, I would agree that that is a part of the process. However, I'm trying to get at why it's not just that it's a commodification, and it's just that it's um, you know technology sort of reproducing rapidly, and so on. I'm trying to get at, why does the subject enjoy it? Why does the subject enjoy it? And I think that those kind of poetries, those kind of artworks, they are, in my opinion, a response to the times, but their form is so constrained, because if you pay attention to the form, that the form, even the form, seems to respond to the lack of leisure that is available for the subject to essentially enjoy art. There is no leisure. There's no real, genuine leisure to enjoy art, and so art responds with its lack of leisure, and the lack of leisure is what um, gives the art the form. So um, this is what is difficult to I think comprehend, because what I started noticing in my own life, when I this is before I started getting into poetry, but I did start getting into poetry in the army. I started getting into poetry, and I was really into reading Rupi Kaur, and I remember it sort of emotionally, like, it was very emotionally visceral, right? Even though the words were simple, but they were, like, punchy. Um, but what I noticed once I started getting into philosophical thought, my philosophical thought, because I was always because philosophical thought essentially forced me to transform my free time into leisure. Um, it my ambition, my correlation to poetry increased. It had to it basically had to evolve. It had to evolve, and that's when I started encountering poets like Rilke, and there's many other more. Fernando Pessoa, these all these poets that are more, in my opinion, very, some of the writings can be very obscure, and they're very ambiguous. And it's very difficult to probably even say what the emotion is, in this sense. But if you wanted to really pay attention to their work, you have to spend a lot of time reading their poetry, and kind of contemplating what is being said. Um, but what I'm trying to say is that poetry these days seems to mimic it seems to be a response to the acceleration. Not that just poetry books are kind of being, you know, uh, going through a mode of production where it is fast, but I'm saying that the subject themselves don't even have the leisure to tackle what we would say as perhaps great works of art. But this is where talking about great works of art versus um, Rupi Kaur's poetry of art, to me, is not an applicable conversation to have about whether it's a great work of art. I think what's going on, in my opinion, what's happening is that if we pay attention, it's not just that art is, that there's great and then lower forms of art. It's not just that. It's that art itself is responding. And this is something even Michelle Gardner talked about in one of the talks that I hosted, the Buber conversations, as she talked about art and its metaphysical connotations and reflections. Um, but what I'm trying to get at is that it seems, because not only is Isabel Miller responding to an era and describing the era, what I'm trying to say is that there is something happening with art um, and it does seem, in my opinion, and 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 strangely enough, I have to say this, that even though there's concerns about ethic, like even though there's concerns about AI art, to me that usually the conversation around AI art is around the ethics, right? Like, oh, now nobody is creating the art really, now it's just some machine creating the art. But I want to really focus in on why that should not necessarily be the entire issue, because it's, to me, it's the form of art, not necessarily who or what's making it. But if we want to take AI art as a real response, um, I would say is that AI art can simply just take combinations, right? It seems, at least this is what I've noticed. AI art can take combinations, the written prompts, and sort of borrow everything and throw it in together. The difficulty with this is that there seems to be, it seems to be devoid of any real leisure. What do I mean by that? I mean that the moment the subject knows that an AI made this art, I feel like that already detracts from the subject wanting to pay attention to what was made versus who made it. Um, and I feel like there's a lot to talk. There's a lot on that idea. I feel like there's a lot on that idea, and I feel like the form of art today seems to be a response to the lack of leisure. Um, and it seems to be really the art itself as a kind of deprivation. And I feel like you can really find this in micro poetry, and why it's so viscerally strong for people emotionally is because there is no leisure for the subject to actually grapple or attempt to understand the world and themselves. And so, with the little time that they do have, art has come in and been a sort of effective force to compensate for that deprivation. Um, but the reason why it's disturbing is not because not because it alleviates the deprivation, but it fools us into thinking that this is just poor and ridiculous art. And in some sense, it's yes, but also it's a reflection of society. It's a reflection of how we're so deprived that a simple line like "I feel lonely in a dark room" is so viscerally effective because the subject is so deprived from its own leisurely contemplation that the only time that it can have any source or any interaction of contemplation is reading something like that, because they don't even have time to think for themselves in this sort of way. They don't have a real leisure time to contemplate. Um, because free time is sort of more like, what should I do with my free time? It's sort of nothingness. Um, so yeah, it seems like the form of art seems to meet the metaphysical form, you could say, of what is perpetuating society. Um, and if I were to take a sort of Platonic view, um, actually, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to even go there. But yeah, I think I'll just end there. It's something that is something is being communicated uh, to that kind of art, and it's the same thing with the novels. I think by Hoover or something, Colleen Hoover. I think that's the artist, the writer. I mean, um, there's something to that, and there's also something to the sort of TikTok phenomenon of the NPCs. Um, and all the other stuff. How everything's been cut. There's been like a cut. Everything's shorter. Everything's quick, processed, cut, 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 cut. Everything is chopped into such minuscule digestible pieces to accommodate for the acceleration and perpetuation of the lack of leisure, that it's perverting, in some sense, it's perverting art. But it's not because the art itself is perverted. It just shows that, reality is now perverted. It's completely been obscene, But yeah, there's so much to think about that, rather than simply labeling art as lower or higher. Um, I think there's room for that, but I don't think at this moment that is a. I don't think at this moment it's a beneficial conversation to have. Mainly because it just persists in a value judgment, and what do we mean by these values of good and higher and lower forms, um, and so on. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed that. Take care.